All right, let's talk about utilitarianism. The theory in general has a really lovely structure. It's elegant, actually. If we can identify something that's good, that's uncontroversially good, that is maybe even the only good thing that everything else is kind of explained in terms of. Look, we acknowledge that pleasure is a good thing, so why not make an ethics out of that, right? If pleasure is always good and pain is always bad, then the right thing to do is just whatever produces the most pleasure and the least pain. Not individual pleasure, everyone counts. Not just in the moment, long-term counts too. Jeremy Bentham, who seems to be the first person to really develop this into a theory distinct from a general kind of Epicurean pleasure-seeking, right? Bentham sees Epicurus as behind this in some way, right? He sees his view as building on what Epicurus has said about pleasure being the good. Now, already we might have some objection here. And in fact, Mill's qualifications, Mill's changes to the theory, or Mill's version of the theory, that's a better way of thinking of it, hits some of this too. But let's think first more generally. If we're going to say that pleasure is good, and that ethics is determined really by the good of pleasure, then we need to be able to say, and this feels a little risky, we need to be able to say that pleasure is always good and pain is always bad. Now, that doesn't, is that really that different from what we were saying before? It's not that different from what we were saying before, but recognize how shocking a statement is. Suppose we have some kind of like Dexter-like serial killer. Utilitarian kind of has to say that Dexter's doing good. And even the pleasure that Dexter gets out of the killing, that goes in the plus category, right? It feels a little odd to me, right? So let's see some examples tied up with this objection. It's not a very strong objection, but all right, so what we're doing when we're making decisions as a utilitarian is we're taking stock of our options. Here we've got option 1 and option 2, and there would be as many other options as we can think of, which is an interesting... There's another objection there, right? Okay, so option 1, we're going to count up the pleasure, put it in the plus column, count up the pain, put it in the minus column, and we'll do the same with all the other options, and then we compare, and whichever option has a greater sum is the thing we should do. Okay, so if we're saying, hey, should Dexter be murdering this potential scumbag? I've actually never seen Dexter. Like, he murders bad people, though, right? The pleasure Dexter gets from the murder would go in the plus column here. The pain of the murdered would go in the minus column, and then the victims of the murdered person, right? That pain is not felt, right? That'll go in the plus column, and so on. So it feels a little odd to say even that some what we might think of I know this word gets thrown around too much, but what we might think of as truly and honestly perverse pleasures. We can't really make sense of perverse pleasures in this way. I mean, actually, no. Yeah, I mean, it just goes in the plus side. It's pleasure. So that person likes that thing. It's pleasure. It goes in the plus side. Now, what we can do is explain why causing pain itself is bad. That's good, right? Causing pain itself is bad because most of the time, right, the action is bad because most of the time there's going to be another option that produces more pleasure and less pain. Not causing that pain is an option that produces more pleasure, less pain, causes less pain. So usually, right, the pleasure of causing pain is going to be swamped by the pain of causing pain, and that won't be a good action. But whether it's right or wrong, whether it's good or bad, really is going to depend on the total amount of pleasure minus pain. If it's the option that has the greatest amount of pleasure minus pain, then it's the best option, even if some of that pleasure seems a little problematic. Now, maybe Mill, like I said, right, people usually don't just embrace these theories, warts and all. They theorize their way around some of these problems. Maybe that's what Mill's doing when he suggests that, right, responding to an objection, that utilitarianism isn't an ethics fit for swine. It's a human ethics. There are special pleasures, intellectual pleasures, refined pleasures. The difference between dining and eating, as some people have claimed, fits in here. There's a qualitative difference in dining as opposed to just eating. There's pleasure in dining. There's pleasure in eating, but the pleasure in dining is on a different level, some will say. So Mill is saying that there are some pleasures that just count more. Not because they're more pleasant, but because they're better. Mill, what makes these better? What makes these better? He doesn't say. But what he does is says that we all know it to be true. He says when someone has experienced both, the high pleasure of dining and the low pleasure of eating, for instance, they'll recognize the difference. And their preferences will reflect that difference. He says they will. Is that always true? I don't know. I mean, would I rather go have a fine dining experience or eat something, quick and easy comfort food? I can't even figure that out because it's so wrapped up with the money of it all. But it's an interesting question. But notice how this changes the elegance of the theory. The elegance is, the structure of the theory says, hey, we recognize that something's good and that its opposite is bad, so we build an ethics out of that. Okay, but now some of the goods are even more good, and why? More good than others, and why? I don't know. Is it going to change the calculation on some things? Yes, it's going to change the calculation on some things. What do we do with this? Well, we could try to reduce what Mill claims the qualitative differences are, right? If we want to say that there are some goods, like, let's say, the pleasure of friendship, as opposed to other goods, the pleasure of a McDouble from McDonald's. Some of these goods just matter more. just count more. Okay, so that's what Mill wants, right? Special status for some important human pleasures. How do we get it? How do we say that these, intellectual pleasures are, more significant than gross bodily pleasures, right? How do we do that? One is we could say something about the tendency of these to produce others, right? We could reduce it to some of the quantitative. We say intellectual pleasures tend to bring about more pleasures, while physical pleasures actually have a tendency to bring about some pain, especially if we overindulge in them, right? So there's a long-term way in which the higher pleasures will just yield more of the pleasure stuff. Okay. But that's not what Mill's doing. Mill wants something bigger. But introducing something bigger, doesn't it require you to have a more robust sense of the value of pleasure? Or a more robust account of value that doesn't just put value on pleasure? I feel like there's work left undone here by Mill in explaining the grounds of the qualitative difference here. And without that, I feel like we either have to kind of make it reputable or kind of just, I don't know, accept this as a auxiliary hypothesis, as some kind of added on extra thing that Mill lends to utilitarianism that maybe we accept, maybe we don't. I mean, we should acknowledge that there are different kinds of utilitarianism, different kinds of utilitarians that place different kinds of value on things. Some utilitarians, negative utilitarians, that's an interesting one. Pleasure, we don't care about pleasure. It is all about reducing pain. Comes to better conclusions usually, actually. Another one, which maybe is more close to this, preference satisfaction. Preference satisfaction utilitarians, it's not all about pleasure. It's not all about, it's about how many of your preferences are satisfied in this course versus that course. The course that satisfies the most people's preferences is the one we should pursue. So it kind of democratizes this. Instead of it being about pleasure, about this quality, it's more about the people, like, getting a say. But also, if you do say happiness, human happiness, is rather different than pleasure, then you could be a utilitarian for happiness. But then, I mean, one of the interesting things about utilitarianism is that it's not purely human. I mean, it often ends up being that way because, human suffering, conscious suffering, aware suffering is qualitatively different than pain. Most people seem to agree. So, yeah, what do you do about that, right? But if pleasure and pain is what we're making this ethics out of, then every being that experiences pleasure and pain is a being that counts. Does the rock count? No. Does the tree count? Maybe, but certainly not as much as the cat. Certainly not as much as the child. Anyway, you get the idea.